I know you all wear many, many different hats and have so many things that you have done throughout your careers. So I think just sort of highlight a few that are in connection to the reason why we're here, sort of celebrating the 60 years of Arch and community design in Harlem. So we can go sort of down the row, and maybe we'll start with you, Roberta, and then we'll just go down the row.
Thanks.
You can just use them.
So in my case, I was not around when Arch was at its height. Yes, I can. Okay. Hi. So I was just saying, I wasn't around when Arch was at its height. I came later, and I think because I knew Max and understood some of what his philosophies were in terms of architecture, doing for the community, and how to change a city or an area of a part of a city through design. Because I wanted to understand that, I became friends with Max, and it followed a trip to Africa where he explained to students at Columbia who were part of this trip the importance of sharing skills, and the importance of being able to identify problems, not just where you are, but where others are living, and figure out a way to contribute to make it better. The first part of the program is about Arch and how it works, and how people have participated in it. And I think that for me, because I came after, my story is really about what I learned from other folks who were part of Arch, and trying to place it in history, and also looking at the effect of Arch on architects like myself who followed, right? And one of them has to do with what happened in terms of design and community involvement, and how it's different now than it was. Anyway, so that is my
Thank you, Roberta. Wayne?
Thank you, Vanessa, and I want to thank the Bond Center for inviting me to be a panelist. If Roberta came on the scene after Arch, I came on much after, because when Arch was at its height, I think I was in either elementary school or just going into junior high school. So it's also interesting to reflect on what was going on then, and to see how it has informed architecture education and even the practice moving forward. In terms of my connection to the panel, I'm an architect planner that spent maybe half of my career doing community revitalization initiatives, both with Harlem Community Development Corporation, and Curtis Archer's on another panel, we'll talk about that later, and also with Manhattan Community Board 12, which represents not Harlem, but Washington Heights and Inwood, and quite frankly, the challenges of Upper Manhattan, the challenges of communities of color do not change if you're going from one community board to the other. So looking at Harlem CDC, we worked heavily with affordable home ownership, and we were working with affordable home ownership. If you remember some of the photos of those vacant, abandoned buildings, that's what we were working with. That was the template that we were working with to bring back community. And we were working with, residential market and sales to community residents to understand that they too can be can own, part of their community, home buyer education, but also incentivizing other community and economic development initiatives. Once again, Yvonne Stennett from the Community League of the Heights will be on another panel. We worked with Cloth on initiatives. So there are a number of things that I've been involved with as Director of Residential Development at Harlem CDC that deal with the theme of community design. Closer to home with Community Board 12, I was drafted to be the chair of the Land Use Committee in 2003 and have not been allowed to retire. And working with the Bond Center's predecessor, we executed the first and to date only district-wide neighborhood planning and land use study for Washington Heights and Inwood, looking at things such as preserving neighborhood character and contextual zoning and historic preservation. So there again, we're looking at who are the players that are working in the community design field today. And like Vanessa, I too am a graduate of the City College School of Architecture. I'm a few decades before her in 1980.
I'm Brian Goldstein. I'm an architectural and urban historian. I teach in those subjects at Swarthmore College. Thank you, Mo, for teeing my work up a little bit. I wrote the 2017 book, The Roots of Urban Renaissance, Gentrification and the Struggle Over Harlem, which is a history of the concept of community development in Harlem from the 60s to the 2000s. And in that is also a history of the life and afterlife of Arch. And we'll talk certainly about the life of Arch, and I hope our panel also can bring out some of the afterlife, because I think in ways that people don't always realize, it has reverberated, some very traceable and known, some maybe less so. My research interests are especially in the ways that architecture and planning and the design professions have intersected with the civil rights movement, the ways the civil rights movement reshaped both, and also related to that, a long-term interest in the history of African-American architects. And I am writing a biography about Max Bond, which will be called If Architecture Were for People, the life and work of J. Max Bond Jr., and hopefully will be out in 2026. And certainly am excited to talk about him, although I'm sure I will also mention the other directors of Arch, who I think are also worth kind of thinking a little bit about, because it had 4 directors, actually 4.5, if you count a co-director. So we'll have time for those things, I'm sure, on our panel.
Excuse me. Maybe I need I'm Walter Mitchell, and unlike many of the others on this panel, I was there at the beginning. I'm from Washington, D.C., and we basically in Washington, D.C. Proceeded to do everything that we could to follow in the Arch model and to proliferate that.
Melvin, can you talk into the microphone?
Can I?
It should be on.
Just turn 45 degrees touch.
Oh, okay, excuse me. All right, okay, all right. So, couple of things. The connections, and this is what I want to talk somewhat about, the connections between Arch here in New York and Washington, D.C. Go very, very deep. As a matter of fact, everything that 125th Street has been experiencing from its inception to today is also happening in Washington, D.C. on U Street and what's called Black Broadway. But I want to focus on the question, who fills the arts today, and also to add some speculation on what J. Max Bond would be doing today. And I might add, he would be, I think, if he were with us, he'd be a sprightly 88-year-old, probably the Dean Emeritus of the school, and that's just 4 years my senior. So I hope I've put that into some perspective for you. But I also, and we can come back to this, but I also want to say on the subject or the issue of today and what would be the Arch today, I'm going to want to delve into why I think that would continue to be the City College of New York and the Spitzer School of Architecture, because with well, there are all sorts of precedents for that. And what I also want to do is to come back, I hope I'll have the opportunity to, is to go deeper on Max Bond, the Max that I knew from the beginning, from the time back when he was setting things up at Arch, and I was in D.C., a new graduate, and with a new young scientist wife who had an American Express credit card, which allowed me to bring to MJQ to fly us up here to sit at Max's feet and learn. So hopefully.
Great. Thank you so much, Melvin. So first, I sort of want to talk a little bit about the context of Arch, and I'm gonna go back to you, Melvin, for this question. We want to sort of, how has the Architects Renewal Committee of Harlem shaped the practice of community design and Harlem's physical development over the years? And really here, it's like, do you have a personal story you'd like to share about maybe that visit when you came to Arch? Just sort of it would be interesting to see, because you had a very personal connection with Arch, so I'd love for you to share that.
Well, again, I want to make sure that we understand that my group, the 2MJQ, and for anybody that's curious, that was it was a riff on the modern jazz quartet, 2 M's, a J, and a Q. And the Q was Harry Quintana. Yes, that Harry Quintana who was here in New York, headed a real great society. And so what we have to understand here is that by the time Hatch and Max in the transition had gotten the Arch going, they had already also, to what extent they understood or not, had nationalized or caused the nationalization of this entire, of what they were doing across the country, including the federalization of it, in which the federal government, through cities, was setting up these community design centers. Now, what I basically brought, or what we brought to the table as 2MJQ, me and Harry and the others, was the historically black college and university angle on all of this. Our goal simply was to take what Max was doing at Arch and to to install it at all of the, at the time, 6 or 7 historically black college and universities that were producing architects and planners, and that's really what we were all about. And again, it's so important that we understand these connections, both between D.C. and New York, and the whole community design center concept and experience, and how it really was started right here with the Bond and Hatch Arch.
Great, thank you. Brian, do you want to maybe sort of share a little bit more context? I know in all of your research, perhaps there's some really interesting sort of stories on sort of what was happening during that time. Maybe you want to share some anecdotes with the audience.
Sure. I was kind of tracing the influence of the organization as kind of having 3 flavors, I guess, and I don't want to skip your question, so I guess I would just emphasize the degree to which the mid-'60s were a fertile moment of experimentation in which, of course, the social movement context was crucial, but also the federal government was willing to push money to the grassroots in a way that was fairly new, and also there was an array of foundations like the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Brothers Fund that were also giving money, and we'll talk about sustainability shortly perhaps, but those allowed people like Hatch and then his succeeding directors to experiment in ways that hadn't really been possible, and that made the kind of context for Arch possible. It made a group like that possible. One thing about Arch that I think is so important to understand is that the ideas were abstract. People should have power over their communities, architects should be involved, but the actions were very concrete in location. There was a real precision to their approach, and so we can trace specific neighborhoods like the East Harlem Triangle, West Harlem, Morningside Park area, the State Office Building site, which we'll see in panel 3, so I won't preempt that. Those allowed them to kind of build the kinds of associations that then they could draw upon, for actions. Also, groups like the Harlem Commonwealth Council, which isn't exactly as much of a dynamo as it was in past decades. HCC was a direct outgrowth of Arch. Actually, the initial people who founded it included Richard Hatch, and the kind of move to Black Power later in the 60s brought on people like Donald Simmons, Preston Wilcox, who all had direct ties to Arch. I also want to mention, because I don't know if he's going to do it, is Ken Knuckles here yet? I don't think so. Arch started a program called Architecture in the Neighborhoods, which was a training program for young people who hadn't completed high school to get graduation equivalency degrees and then enroll in architecture schools, which, many similar things exist, maybe fewer than we'd like. But this is a legacy, again, of kind of being very tactical, and Ken was a product of that program. I hope he'll talk about that on our third panel. Maybe I'll stop there.
Curious, Roberta or Wayne, do you want to add anything, personal stories related to sort of Arch? Or we can...
I think, like I said, because I came after the fact, but because I was curious, I wanted to know, more about it, and get more information about some of the things I was hearing. And like Brian, I was also interested in writing about it, and so I started writing about the collective history of Black architects in New York. And part of that history does deal with Arch. So there's life before Arch, and there's life during Arch, and then there's life after Arch. And although my participation is basically in the part after Arch, I think that being able to interview folks who were around, who were part of Arch, made it clearer to me what it must have been like. I'm imagining how exciting it must have been to be a part of Arch, to be able to participate in those kinds of projects. Like you mentioned, the training of art. What was just mentioned was this whole idea of training of architects, and that was one of the things that when I started reading about Arch, I was like most excited about. And I got to speak to Ken Simmons, Sons, and to others, a couple of other folks, including Ken Knuckles. But the idea that, it's sort of a bold idea, that you should, that architecture was like too great an area to leave to people who have money and who had the possibilities of being able to produce it, and that there must be a way that Black folks can become more involved in developing their cities, their areas, and that has to do with having an understanding of what the situation is and what the problems are, and that whole program of training architects is like a very fascinating one, and the way the story was told to me is that that sometimes people who were not ever really thinking about architecture were like sort of pulled off the street because they weren't doing anything else, and they came to a session or two, And they were persuaded to think about architecture. I mean, because perhaps they weren't thinking about anything else, especially when they were told that it's possible, if you hung with us, to be taught, to have an opportunity to learn what architecture is and how you might participate in it. Now, not everybody, of course, is like, once you tell them what it is, there's still some folks who are not going to be excited about it. But I think they told the story in a way that made it seem like at least it was worth considering. And so the dropout factor is high. Not everyone stayed to the end. And even those, but if you stayed, you did get really more than the kind of introduction that people going to college would have gotten, right? And you got placed in an architectural firm. You were able to have meetings and talks with designers and architects about what it is that you could do that you never thought you could do. And yes, the dimensions of how many folks actually graduated from a program are not as great as they could have been, or I wish they were. But I think that this was like a way of at least saying to people in the neighborhood, architecture exists. And maybe if you haven't heard about it before, it's maybe something that you should think about, right? And the fact that they were able to raise money to send people to college is also incredible. And that they were able to place people who started off at ground zero in firms, and that it was done as a coalition of the AIA and firms who were interested in advancing the learning of and increasing the number of participants in design in Harlem itself is important. And so I think that that's like one of the, when I looked at it, I was really interested in that program. And there was one other program one other event that I was interested in, and that was the idea of electing or having appointed the first member, African American, to be on the planning commission, right? And even at that time, it seemed like, wow, it was really late to not have any black folks on the city planning commission, and for that to be taken up as a cause seemed like a really great idea whose time had come, and to understand the theatrics that was involved to make that possible was also interesting, because it wasn't just the straight protest kind of thing that I would have thought was going to be the first crack at how to change the City Planning Commission. It was to work with the Real Great Society, right? So the two organizations together plotted, and it's sort of like a public relations kind of event to how to, but they plotted how to get the city to change their mind, right? And what is involved in that. And it was theatrics, it was like Harry Quintana, it was like people taking seats and being thrown out by the police, but being filmed, and until Max at one time told me that he was asked by Mayor Lindsay, maybe it's in the book, that if he wanted to become the commissioner that they were fighting for, and he declined because that, he said, wasn't the point. Yes, he thought he could if he wanted, but that wasn't the point. And so they played it out all the way until the city gave in, and I can't remember his name, but there's a lawyer was the first African American there. But I think that those, like, to me, are just two really exciting approaches to problems that you don't normally see being resolved by organizations that follow the rules, the regular rules.
Wayne, I'm just going to ask you to sort of chime in a little bit on this, but I think one of the things that was really interesting that Roberta mentioned was the advocacy effort of trying to get change at the sort of, I don't know, the concept of citizen architect has sort of popped up in my head, and I know you've done lots of public service, and so I wonder, is there potentially a connection between sort of Arch, or the idea of sort of how do you engage community as sort of an architect, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
I was thinking about that very point as Roberta was speaking, because although I came along after, you know, the height of the activism of Arch, when I think about some of the conversations in graduate school, and I was part of a cadre who did both architecture and planning, many of the staff on the architecture side would say, you know, you need to decide if you want to be the architect or the client, because they thought the joint degree is what we would call the joint degree students were focusing sort of too much on, you know, sort of the community issues or the questions that would be dealt with by the client or by the public sector. And for us, that was exactly the point, that if you wait until all of the decisions are made and simply say, here's the program, design it, you've missed the opportunity to impact it. And I would say that in New York City now, particularly in Manhattan, but I think it may be citywide, there's an effort to get more architects to apply for membership on their local community boards. Because so much of what we're dealing with, whether it's, you know, zoning or massive replanning or looking at, you know, particular developments, you're dealing with the field of architecture and construction, which we understand. And as I said, I was drafted, I didn't volunteer, I was drafted to be chair of Land Use Committee Award 12, but, you know, we went through a massive rezoning in Inwood. I think we had meetings once a month for 18 months to talk about that. And if you don't understand what city planning is talking about, what EDC is talking about, then how do you, you know, realistically impact or articulate what it is you want to happen or not happen with this plan that will have impacts for years to come? So I think the citizen architect is something that is critical. And, you know, I was talking yesterday with some of my colleagues about how the profession needs to maybe acknowledge or raise up the citizen architect a bit more than it does, you know, sort of the traditional practice. You know, I designed this building, I designed that building, I designed that building. But, you know, working with community-based organizations, you know, working, you know, with community boards to help them to articulate what it is that works or doesn't work for community, and in fact to help to flesh out what are the different aspects of community, because community is never singular, and you find that at the community board in your first meeting, there are different voices advocating or arguing or yelling at you for different things, and how you take that and condense it into a program that works, I think is critical.